Curtis Bay is a community of color and low income. It is also a community that at every turn you will be met by some polluting industry, such as a trash burning incinerator, landfill, open air coal pile next to a wreck, medical waste incinerators, and various chemical and gas and oil companies. All of these companies together have created cumulative impacts on health. Sadly, this is not a new story. We have seen this before, over 100 times. And each time, it has been referred to as an accident, that these communities are put together to be a sacrifice zone. There are so many sacrifice zones across the world. So I'll give you some of the events that has happened in Curtis Bay history, 100-year history, whether it was a leak, a spill, explosion, or fire. And you tell me if it was an accident. How could we learn from this history so it doesn't repeat itself?
One night in 1913, a small fire at an oil company quickly became a terrifying drum of flame and explosion, bringing fear to the village of Wagner's Point. 6 buildings burned down that night, containing 20,000 barrels of oil and more than 100,000 gallons of gasoline. The main concern at the time was saving as much of these products as possible. 2 people were injured trying to do so.
In 1917, in the heat of the First World War, the U.S. government chose Curtis Bay for a new ordnance depot because of its railway infrastructure. The military used the depot for munitions storage and experiments with gunpowder safety until 1926, when a massive munitions explosion in New Jersey made evident the danger. Nearly twice as much explosive material was stored here in Curtis Bay, on the edge of the city of Baltimore.
The Baltimore Sun reported on local protests calling for the removal of explosives from Curtis Bay. Under the headlines, "Explosives Brought Up Again." The report describes loaded shells of various sizes, small arm ammunition, and smokeless powders. After a protracted battle with Congress, during which efforts to make the munitions safe resulted in multiple deaths, the explosives were finally removed in 1930.
In the 1950s, the decommissioned Ordnance Depot was repurposed as a new home for 5.25 million pounds of radioactive thorium nitrate crystals. The U.S. Atomic Energy Commission chose Curtis Bay to play a key role in shoring up the nation's defense once again. Within a few decades, many of these crystals had leaked into the topsoil, with massive spikes of radiation found at multiple hotspots by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission.
In September of 1969, 70,000 gallons of heating oil gushed out of a faulty valve at the Hess Corporation oil dump in Curtis Bay. At least 200 gallons of oil seeped into the waters of the harbor. A few months later, 500 gallons of petroleum leaked into the harbor at Curtis Bay as a Harp Tanker Corporation ship tried to discharge its cargo at the Hess terminal. The substance coated the water for days before it was removed. Both Hess and Harp denied responsibility.
In 1970, a tanker loading up at the Conoco Pier in Curtis Bay allowed 1,200 tons of lye, or caustic soda, to sink to the bottom of the bay. The ship was still cleared to depart for Delaware City. The president of the concerned transportation company remarked the lye would do no harm, suggesting that it would be good for the quality of the water. Meanwhile, investigators found the pH of the water in the bay spiked from 7 to 12.5, higher than ammonia.
In 1972, the FMC Corporation was fined $10,000 for dumping chemical pollutants from its Curtis Bay facility into Stonehouse Cove. Rather than task this billion-dollar international chemical manufacturing firm with financing the cleanup themselves, the city of Baltimore issued a $6 million tax-exempt bond for pollution controls at a new FMC pesticide plant. FMC also produced rocket fuel in Curtis Bay at a facility that the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency found to be leaking a cancer-causing chemical in 1975.
On March 23, 1977, Henry Bernowski, an employee of Conoco, died of multiple myeloma, a very rare blood cancer. 6 months later, the Baltimore Sun raised concern over the unusual number of rare cancer cases among Conoco's employees. While the company boasted about its efforts to reduce exposure to benzene, a known carcinogen, the cancer diagnoses did not stop. Conoco employees woke up every morning and headed to the factory, respirators in hand.
In 1981, several barrels of toxic materials exploded at the American Recovery Company in Curtis Bay. 2 employees suffered burns. In the same year, 24 city firefighters were treated at area hospitals when a barrel containing an unknown acid exploded at another nearby site, enveloping the firefighters in a toxic mist. In the same year, the state made plans to build yet another toxic waste disposal facility at a local site, where the groundwater was already contaminated by existing toxic waste dumps.
In 1987, the Delta Chemical Corporation discharged up to 7,500 gallons of chemical waste into the Patapsco River. Delta Chemical Corp was only one of 82 industries that polluted the Patapsco River that year. Heavy metals such as lead, chromium, and zinc were found in the water at levels unsafe for both human and aquatic life. People are probably not going to drop dead, but there is nevertheless a serious risk to public health, a professor at the University of Maryland stated. But what is a life of ulcers, asthma, and lung cancers if not a slow death?
In 1989, a South Baltimore-based chemical company named Alkalac pled guilty to illegally exporting hundreds of tons of thiodiclycol, a component of mustard gas, to Iran and Iraq. At the time, the two countries were engaged in war and relied heavily on chemical warfare, either knowingly or unknowingly. The chemical was used to carry out heinous war crimes, including the Kurdish genocide ordered by Saddam Hussein. At the end of the trial, Alkalac was only charged with a $500,000 fine for the mass destruction it helped to perpetuate.
In 1998, Wagner's Point was named one of the top 10 most at-risk communities in the US for a worst-case chemical accident. That October, a fire and explosion at the Conda Vista chemical plant in Wagner's Point sent workers and a few residents to the hospital. Shortly before the incident, it was noted, the reactors contained 180 gallons of a sludge-like mixture made up of aluminum chloride, paraffin, hydrogen, water, and benzene, and known cancer-causing chemical. Over the next few years, Conda Vista and other local companies bought out local residents, and Wagner's Point was no longer a residential community.
In December 2004, residents of Curtis Bay called for a close to the medical waste incinerator that had plagued the community for more than a decade. The Maryland Department of the Environment found a mercury emissions level 400 times the legal limit, building on a history of hundreds of carbon monoxide violations, dozens of hydrogen chloride violations, and repeated failures in pollution testing. When ingested, mercury can cause respiratory problems and brain damage in children, and pose severe dangers for aquatic life. Several advocacy groups joined the battle, but the movement met with staunch opposition from local institutions. The incinerator continues to operate today, and was recently sold to a company based in California.
In 2010, Brasco shut off their mercury control systems, leading to the incinerator exceeding their mercury emissions limit. State officials says the operator of the Baltimore incinerator had agreed to pay $77,500 in fine for the alleged air pollution violation. The incinerator remains the worst stationary source of air pollution in Baltimore City.
One Saturday in 2012, a 477-foot tanker crashed into one of the CSX coal piers in Curtis Bay. The tanker was speeding, and no one on board had sounded the warning whistle. The collision destroyed 200 feet of dock and injured a dock worker, resulting in a 2-month shutdown of the pier and affecting coal distribution throughout the East Coast. The shipping company quietly settled with CSX as if nothing had ever happened.
The
Between 2014 and 2016, South Baltimore's Maryland Performance Diesel was found to have sold, manufactured, or installed nearly 3,700 defeat devices on local diesel motor vehicles, designed to mechanically bypass and defeat the vehicle's emissions controls. The modest civil penalty the company was required to pay did not discourage other companies from performing the same vehicle modifications in subsequent years.
On September 3, 2016, Chimera Water Solutions spilled over 3 tons of ferrous chloride near the Patapsco River water treatment facility. Ferrous chloride can burn the eyes, skin, and respiratory tract, and is harmful to ingest. The spill was contained and neutralized, but it was later determined that Chimera had neglected to file required reports on 17 hazardous chemicals stored in their Curtis Bay facility. For these violations and all the human and environmental health risks they posed, Chimera was fined just $20,000.
In 2017, the Solvay Industries facility in Fairfield, formerly known as Alcolac, was responsible for the leakage of a giant cloud of chlorosulfonic acid in South Baltimore, triggering a shelter-in-place mandate for residents. Chlorosulfonic acid is a dangerous superacid that can cause lung edema and tooth erosion through prolonged exposure. Officials determined that the spill posed no hazard, and the mandate was lifted in a couple of hours as if nothing had happened. Solvay maintains a pattern of operating in low-income, struggling communities all around the nation.
In December 2021, there was an explosion at the CSX facility. The explosion, I remember vividly. I was in my kitchen and there was a boom. It felt like the house was lifted up and dropped. Thought it was an earthquake, but it felt worse than an earthquake. I called 311 to find out what had happened, and the person was in another county, said they felt it as well. I worry with these series of incidences in communities. One time it's an accident, but continuous patterns of disaster, it shows that there are injustices in place and that someone or multiple people are turning a blind eye to the reality of the issues in our community.
You should not have to fight this hard for a basic human right. What does over 100 years of policy that puts the burden on victims of disaster after disaster do to communities? One by one, it wipes us off the map. It didn't matter that the African American residents of Fairfield or the European immigrants at Winans Point sacrificed everything in service to their country. At the end of the day, none of that mattered. When it came time to choose between the health of these residents and workers and doing anything to hold owners of polluting industry accountable. But now, we in Curtis Bay and surrounding neighboring counties in South Baltimore are still facing the daily threats of the next explosion, the next leak or spill, and the contamination buried beneath the very soil we walk upon. We are responding to the past 100 years of environmental injustice with a commitment right now to a new vision to put our lives and our communities first without ever making us choose between the health of our people and the health of our local economy. Today we are calling for 1. Stronger standards that protects our health, worker safety, and our shared environment, including a cumulative impact law that takes into account the pollution sources a community already has before adding more. 2. Development funds to mitigate the cost of hosting toxic waste infrastructure for decades, including direct reparations for residents who have suffered for so long. paired with a just transition for zero waste and green development fund to develop new community-owned compost, recycling, deconstruction, reuse, green infrastructure, and housing. 3. Protections for sanitation and other workers as we transition from this outdated technology to a current approach. We have to end the subsidies for incinerators, landfill, and other dirty energy sources we are transitioning away from, while we are building a strengthening local end market for composting, recycling commodities, and truly renewable energy.